If you like military history and want to learn even more, read my book O Atomo como Arma, which will tell you how atomic bombs were created and used in World War II. To buy your copy, just go to Amazon or WeClap, but if you want to buy it autographed by me for you, send an email to saladeguerra.com with your zip code so I can calculate the shipping. Of the craziest stories from the FEB, and the FEB has a lot of crazy stories, the story of the tank theft by a group of Brazilian soldiers in Italy during World War II is one of the stories most often repeated online. Back at the beginning of the channel, I think Sala de Guerra was less than a year old. I made a video about FEB myths and about the myths I debunked at that time. It was exactly this one, the one about the Sherman tank theft by Brazilian soldiers. Well, why in short would this not be feasible? Because a tank of that size would attract a lot of attention. Actually, there's no way to hide a vehicle like that, and it's clearly a vehicle that doesn't belong to an infantry division, which was the case with the Brazilian division. So there's no way to just paint over the tank and pretend it belonged to the FEB. We also know that there weren't any tank drivers qualified or trained in that type of driving within the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. Although historians do acknowledge that the theft of smaller vehicles was, in fact, a common occurrence. During the war operations in Italy, not only involving the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, but any military unit at that time, the theft of a large vehicle like a tank never happened. But you know the question that sticks with me. Where did this story come from? Because if you stop to think about it, it's a very specific story. It's about the theft of a Sherman tank. And recently I found myself thinking about this case again, because I think we can relate this myth of the tank to another myth of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, which is the myth that Stan Laurel, the skinny one from Laurel and Hardy, was fighting on the American front line with a chemical warfare unit, creating the smokescreen that passed over Paretta Terme, and the whole region of the Reno River Valley to mask the city, which was the headquarters of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. But Laurel at that time was 57 years old. He was basically a Hollywood millionaire living in his house in California and had nothing to do with the war effort on the front lines in 1945. The curious thing is that I even heard this story from some of the Brazilian soldiers. I heard this story from Sergeant Leonel Junqueira, who fought in that area at that time. In other words, someone who was directly involved in the action. But what we can assume, since it was a mistake, of course, is that someone who worked in the American Chemical Warfare Unit, some American soldier, was probably a lookalike of Stan Laurel, maybe a guy who imitated Stan Laurel. And then this conversation, this game of telephone went from a guy who looks like Stan Laurel to Stan Laurel himself, the skinny guy from Laurel and Hardy, is fighting on our side over in Paretta Terme. But anyway, what would be the explanation for the tank that the FEB supposedly stole? Is there an explanation similar to that one? Look, today I can tell you that I'm almost absolutely sure I've cracked the case. The whole story starts with a regulation from the Ordnance Department of the U.S. Fifth Army over there in Italy. And this regulation prescribed the collection of abandoned vehicles in various locations. Military vehicles abandoned anywhere they were found. This collection, then, could be carried out by any soldier of the Fifth Army, and these vehicles would be sent to a temporary depot before being forwarded to the Ordnance Department. But what would be the reason for authorizing the removal of lost or abandoned vehicles? Well, the first of these reasons is to clear the traffic routes. Many times, jeeps, trucks, and other types of vehicles were left abandoned by drivers right in the middle of an important troop movement route. So, it was extremely necessary to keep these routes clear to keep military traffic moving smoothly. The second reason is to assist the work of the materiel department itself, because these abandoned vehicles were often left behind due to mechanical problems. So if you tow that vehicle and remove it from there, That vehicle can then be sent to the materiel department's yard so that parts can be taken from it. There, any part that can still be used to repair or maintain other vehicles. Finally, it was necessary to prevent the irregular use of these Army military vehicles. Why? Because Italian civilians were getting used to doing this. In fact, the Italian resistance, some units, were stealing these vehicles for their own use. And what was even worse for the United States Army, sailors, United States Navy personnel, were stealing Army vehicles to use as they pleased. And I recently found 2 references to this case in my readings. The first reference is Come Primera Elo na Italia, a book by soldier Fausto Villanova. And the second reference is Sciavante na Italia, also a book by the Expeditionary General Mario Fernandez. The starting point of the whole case happens in October 1944, when the second and third contingents of the FEB arrive in Italy. They dock in Livorno and then go to their camp at Tenuta di San Rossori. There, 10,000 Brazilians are camped waiting for weapons, training, and preparation to head to the front line. There, General Clark visits the newly arrived Brazilians who made up the bulk of the Brazilian division. He gives a few words of encouragement, teaches a few things, and gives some recommendations. And finally, his aides pass them on, the guidelines, the regulations, to which the troops were subjected. And among these regulations was the regulation from the Department of Material on the recovery of abandoned vehicles. However, in that explanation, it was never clear to the Brazilians exactly what exactly counted as an abandoned vehicle, where exactly these vehicles should be taken to. But one thing was clear: there would be no punishment for the soldier who recovered an abandoned vehicle. And it's worth explaining here for those who might not know yet. Military vehicles, especially from that time, didn't have locks, doors, or keys. The engine of these vehicles was started simply by pressing a button on the floor of the car. At the very end of October 1944, the Brazilians camped in San Rosario began to move through the American rear areas throughout that entire region. And then Captain Mario Fernandez, captain of the FEB artillery, along with some other soldiers, took a jeep for a mission in the city of Florence. When they arrived in Florence, the jeep driver parked the jeep in an American military parking lot, which even had 24-hour surveillance by the military police. They even received a receipt for the vehicle that was left in the parking lot and then set out on their mission. They even spent the night at a hotel nearby. But when they returned the next day and went to look for their jeep in the parking lot, it was gone. To their surprise, the jeep isn't there. And then they find out that a truck from an American division parked in the middle of the parking lot during the night. The guys even set up ramps and took the jeep into the back of the truck, which was covered with a tarp. And they just went past the American guards at the gate with the truck's receipt. And the guards didn't even check the back of the truck. Of course, the Brazilian soldiers were furious about what happened. They felt like idiots for being tricked, for trusting the American guards at the parking lot gate. And then they planned their revenge. Later that day, they returned to the parking lot. They saw an American Jeep there, kind of alone, abandoned by its owner. They simply got into the Jeep, started it, and using the receipt from the previous day, they managed to leave the parking lot. They took this Jeep to the house of a Brazilian who had been living in Florence for many years. And there, in that house, they waited until nightfall, because at night it would be much harder to distinguish the Jeep's markings. And from there, they left for the Brazilian camp in Pisa. There in Pisa, the Jeep was repainted with Brazilian markings. And look at this. They even named the vehicle Ali Ali Bobo, which is a combination of Ali Alibaba, the chief of thieves, with Bobo from Bobocas, right? Because they were called that for having their Jeep stolen back in Florence. And interestingly, this Jeep Ali Ali Bobo was lost near Riola in January 1945, when, in the words of General Mario Fernandez, he ran over a Sherman tank with the vehicle. But then, in those first days, the Brazilian soldiers soon realized that taking abandoned vehicles was a habit of all the soldiers in the Fifth Army. Basically, any nationality in the Fifth Army, Americans, British, Indians, South Africans, anyone, all of them could be seen taking vehicles that were just sitting there on the street. And then, with the officers' approval, the FEB personnel just got way too excited about this activity. Many Brazilian soldiers started carrying cardboard and paint with them to paint the Brazilian Southern Cross markings and paint over the American markings wherever they went. And they went even further. Look, they also carried cutouts with the names of wives, mothers, children, cities, all that to name the vehicles and make them even more personalized. There's even a record here of a Brazilian captain who put about 20 drivers in the back of a truck, took these guys to a city 60 kilometers away, and told them, "Everybody get out here. Whoever wants to come back with a vehicle, do it. Whoever doesn't can walk back." The result was that for the next 30 days until the end of November, the FEB had lost 5 vehicles stolen by soldiers from the Fifth Army. But on their side, the Brazilian soldiers managed to get no less than 28 vehicles through that same practice. And these vehicles range from Jeeps, Dodges, 2.5-ton trucks, right? The GMC and CCKW, a U.S. military police vehicle, a Jeep with radio equipment, and finally, according to General Mario Fernandez, a gigantic 12-ton trucks. Then when I read that, I asked myself, a 12-ton truck, what kind of vehicle could that be? And after doing some research, I think I found the answer to that myth from the beginning of the video. This is the 12-ton truck. Diamond T9 186 X4 M20, 12 tons. That impressive vehicle, there was a tank hauler. It carried a trailer behind it that was capable of supporting a Sherman tank. So those vehicles there were the preferred means of transporting tanks over long distances for the United States Army. And why would a vehicle like that be in the vicinity of the FEB's operational area? Well, that's because the U.S. 1st Armored Division operated right next to the FEB. So it's not hard for us to imagine that the American driver simply left the truck there, went to do something, walked away, and the Brazilian soldier saw the opportunity and took the vehicle. Now just imagine the look of disbelief on his colleagues' faces when the Brazilian soldier shows up driving a gigantic truck like that at the camp in Pisa. You'll like to know even more about how they stored the truck, because smaller vehicles like Jeeps could even be hidden inside tents, right? But a truck that size couldn't be hidden. So the Brazilians did the following, according to General Mario Fernandez as well. They simply left it on the road and hung a sign written in German, Achtung Minen, which means caution, mines. It's not to say that no one else could have thought of this, but you have to admire the creativity of the Brazilians in Italy. And that, to me, is the answer to the riddle, because the story being passed from person to person, just like the story of a Stan Laurel lookalike, turns into a story that Stan Laurel himself was on the front line. A tank transporter stolen by the FEB becomes a tank stolen by the FEB. And since this case happened at the camp in Pisa, back in the rear, far from the front line, by the time the story reaches the troops. On the front line, since no one saw it, it could very well have been converted from a tank transporter to a tank. Well, the outcome of all this is that the FEB command itself noticed so many vehicles going missing from other units of the Fifth Army at the hands of the FEB and decided to put an end to that game. At the same time, the Brazilian soldier also became increasingly careful with his own vehicles. And an example of this, as told in the book by Fausto Villanova, is that Lieutenant Jose Cunha Filho, who was the quartermaster of the 1st Liaison and Observation Squadron, when he went to Rome to perform some service or carry out a mission, he would simply remove all 4 wheels from his Jeep and take them into his room where he slept to make sure no one would take the vehicle during the night. And of course, this case of the 28 vehicles stolen by the Brazilian troops in Pisa was not an isolated incident. This kind of event kept happening in smaller numbers until the end of the war. Now tell me, did you already know about this habit among soldiers in World War II of stealing vehicles from neighboring units for their own not hit? Do you think the explanation for the story of the tank stolen by the FEB is the one I just told you? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to get your autographed copy of O Atomo Como Arma, signed by me for you. Just send an email to saladagera.com with your zip code so I can calculate the shipping. If you like this video, then share it with your friends and also give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to Sala de Guerra so you don't miss anything else. I'll stop here for now. Thank you again for watching, and best regards from Sala de Guerra.